Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 129 of 2-Minute Talk Tips, the podcast that opens with a practical public speaking tip in the first 2 minutes of every episode before getting into a deeper discussion about public speaking. Today's tip comes to us from special guest Morgan Lopes.
Talk slower. Oftentimes we get caught up, we get excited because if it's a rehearsed thing, we've been waiting to do this. If it's something that we're passionate about, we like talking about it, but remembering that the audience often is hearing this for the first time. And so breathing and talking a little bit slower, which then also opens the door to pausing more often and giving room for people to catch up.
Stick around, and after the break, we'll hear more from Morgan Lopes. Welcome back. Before we get started, and in the interest of full disclosure, I wanted to mention that I've had a major life change which may impact the way some folks feel about the advice I recommend. I'll share more details at the end of the episode. Once I saw that Morgan Lopes had gotten his start as a public speaker by performing at medieval times, I knew I had to have him on the show. I mean, the dude wore a cape professionally. How awesome is that? For those who don't know, Medieval Times is a small chain of restaurants here in the United States that features a medieval-themed performance with horses and jousting and kings and queens and food that you eat with your hands. And it's meant to be cheesy and a lot of fun. And cheesy, not necessarily in the sense of having cheese, although that does make everything better, but in terms of the light entertainment and faux medieval times that they are trying to recreate. It's sort of like dinner theater that's going to appeal to the whole family. Anyway, this week we hear that story about how Morgan got his start doing that. We hear his perspective on storytelling, and we learn the 3 things that help him manage life as the CEO of one company and the CTO of another company that's trying to eliminate homelessness from the world. So now, let's meet Morgan. All right, Morgan, thank you so much for joining us here on 2-Minute Talk Tips this week.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate your time.
Let's start off at the very beginning. And what was your earliest memory of speaking or performing in front of a group of people?
Earliest memory would definitely go back to childhood and a group performance. And I believe there were ones earlier, but the one that comes to mind, I actually had the closing line of a play that I forgot. And it's an hour-long performance. Everyone's watching their kid and doing all these things, and it had a really great narrative. And I kind of tie it together at the end with this, curtains are open, lights pop on me for the last piece, and I just stand there, wide-eyed, blank face, forgot everything. I think I may have said a word that would have been inappropriate for a kid my age, and then the lights went off and the show was over. It was pretty anticlimactic. Could have probably scarred me, I think, if I was a little less timid. But that was one of my earliest, and it's really anchored in my mind as both maybe the largest failure and then also the earliest I can remember.
Right. So how do you get past that to move on to a career that involves a lot of speaking and having to wrap things up?
Some of it at the time, it ultimately came back to there was a lot of preparation going into it. I knew the line. I think the big part that I took away from that was more practice where the stakes feel higher. Everything up to that point had been very in front of the mirror, in front of small groups, nothing that really put more on the line, had more skin in the game. And so a lot of preparation since then has been trying to do, if I may do a larger presentation, I'm going to try it a couple times first in front of real people who are actually expecting me to deliver a real presentation. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but some show performing that I had done, I would do it in a group of ideally a couple dozen people or a couple hundred people before doing it in front of 1,000 or so people. And so trying to really recreate that performance mode sooner and get some more experience there has definitely made a difference.
That's a great point. I think that also then really highlights the additional value to kids of having those early experiences so that you can get out and get some exposure to the crowd when the stakes are lower. And I mean, sure, the closing line on a play when you're in grade school, that's about as high stakes as it can get for a kid. But you really want to have those failures at that point rather than later when there can be millions of dollars on the line.
Certainly. And I have a teacher in college who would share this experience that he had around rock climbing. And he shared that when he was learning how to free climb outside, so free climbing is where you're bringing your rope up with you along the way. And so you're clipping in, and he had climbed about 15 feet up without clipping again. And so what happens is if you fall from that height, you actually fall 30 feet, right? You fall past your original anchor, and then however much slack you climbed up, you now have to fall that depth. And he would wake up, he said, with night terrors, and he would wake up sweating, and that moment just stuck in his mind. And the encouragement that he gave then, and the realization that he had was, when you have those traumatic moments, you have to wash it out with other moments. And both good and bad, right? You'll have more bad moments, but eventually if you have enough bad moments and enough good moments that counteract them, it all comes back to experience and being willing to put yourself out there and really give your mind a chance to just forget or maybe generalize a lot of those experiences.
So you mentioned some show performances, and you got to do one of the more unique roles in public speaking, performing as the narrator at medieval times. How did that happen?
It was a great story. I came out of, or I was in college, working my way through college, and I was looking for a job that would allow me to make as much money in as little time as possible. And it was actually, it wasn't on the show side of medieval times. It was actually in the serving department. So servers would come in for about 2 to 3 hours. And if you were good, if you were charismatic, if you took care of the people, oftentimes you could take home $150, $200, which in college, that sounded like a pretty great deal. So I did that for a while. And while you're serving, you get to hear the show a lot. You get to watch the show if you're not, when you're not actively handing food out to customers. And so watching the show, hearing it, I was very much the kid who would memorize movies when I was younger. And so I just would sit in my head and I would play with the voices. And as servers, they would tell us we should have more Cockney, what would be considered like impoverished English accents, whereas the royalty spoke more mightily. And so I would play with these, play with the words, the phrases of the show, and got to know it pretty well. And so there was a gentleman in particular who came actually from another castle, as we call it. There are a number around the U.S. He came in town, dynamic, so much energy, brought so much passion to the show. And I love watching this guy in particular perform. And it was then that I thought to myself, I want to do this. And at the time, I was very early 20-something, I think 21, 22. I believe the youngest narrator or MC at the time was maybe 30, 35. And so there's a hill to climb there for sure. But started as a server, watched it enough, and then finally decided I'm going to go for this. And talked to the team, got an interview with the casting director, and a couple months later, was riding out into the show.
Was that as much fun as it sounds like?
It was a blast. Eventually, over the years, as life started to evolve and started a business and all of these other competing priorities, and the nature of the castle had kind of changed a little bit. It became a little less exciting, and that's really when I knew it was time to stop. For me, it was about that excitement. It was about the experience. I got to ride a horse. I got to wear a cape. I got to do all these things that, as a kid, I'm like, man, I would have thought I was awesome. And once it started to feel more like a job and less like something that I was excited to go do, I knew that for this kind of thing, I owed it really to myself and the people that I worked with to hang up the cape.
That's fantastic. And, once you say you get to wear a cape, I'm on board.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, you know what? You dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And when you wear a cape, I think you're pretty much at the top.
Exactly. So, I mean, what were some of the biggest lessons you could take from that experience into your career and life down the road?
One that goes the furthest back, actually, was my first night I was supposed to go on a Sunday. It was going to be a smaller show, 200 or 300 people. And on Saturday, I got called in. The head corporate people were in town, and they wanted to see what the young guy could do. Or at least that's what it felt like. I was a little panicked. This wasn't the moment that I had been visualizing and preparing for. And I remember standing backstage. I climbed onto the horse, which is a very large horse. I couldn't, I feel like sometimes if I was almost straddling him, my legs didn't even feel like they really fell to his side. I'm standing backstage, the curtain's drawn, the horse is right up on the curtain. Darkness behind the curtain. I can hear people, right? The chatter, the mumble of the crowd. Sitting on a horse, got the cape, the tights. At this point, my hair was down my back, full beard, all the things. And my heart is beating out of my chest. Trying to just breathe and take it easy. And I had this moment of pause and reflection and just thought to myself, why the heck am I doing this? But then it became a little bit more of a calm question and trying to remember, why am I doing this? And it wasn't to try and please at this point, it was close to 1,200 people on the other side of the curtain. It was really because it was something that I enjoyed. It was something that allowed me to leverage my gifts and my abilities in a unique way. And ultimately, it was for what I would consider a performance of one. So I'm having this moment beforehand, and I just felt all the anxiety fade away. And there's the opening track. The lights start to spin. The curtain opens. Trumpets blare. And I ride out onto center stage. And it's almost as if I just left all that baggage behind me. And that moment of taking that time before stepping in to do something that feels like there's a lot riding on it, feels like there's a lot on the line, to just breathe. And remember, why are you here? Who are you trying to please in this moment? And allowing just the kind of the truth to wash over you was something that has come up a lot of other times. I fast forward to the birth of my first daughter and had a very similar moment in the waiting room. Freaking out, heart is beating. This is the first time experience for me. And then I just stopped, right? And kind of rehearsed that same thing. And that was something that I don't know where it came from necessarily, but in that moment I realized, whoa, I went from almost complete panic and probably would have train wrecked the beginning part of the show for everyone to a moment of pause and poise. And at least from what the feedback I received after the show, it turned out to be a very great experience that even the corporate people were impressed, which, in my mind couldn't have been better. That was exactly what I was hoping for. And it all really came back to that moment, taking a beat behind the stage. I don't know if I was there for 5 seconds or 5 minutes going through this exercise in my head, but it was very clarifying. And that was something that continues to influence a lot of presentations, or even in a lot of ways making decisions. Is just being able to take that beat. Huge.
You've got to sort of interrupt that pattern of anxiety that builds up.
Yeah, 100%.
So is that what you still do today before most of those presentations, in that 5 minutes before you take the stage?
Usually, so there's, if I'm lucky, I have that time to take a minute. I also like to sit back a little bit and just watch the room and see how are these people, if there's somebody, on stage ahead of me, or if there's not, right, and they're kind of coming in and getting seated, really trying to read the vibe, read the energy in the room, and get a sense of how do I want to complement that, right? We, so often in life, we feel like we have to, fix our weaknesses, right? We have these deficits that we feel like we need to come back from. Whereas I think if we could actually find the strengths and then lean into those. And so a room has those same characteristics. There are things in a room that if you try and change the energy versus leaning into the energy that's already there, it can yield very different results. I see it oftentimes. I'll speak at code schools, for instance, as I do software engineering. And so I'll speak at code schools and students who are learning. And some of them are very young groups and some of them are more middle-aged groups. And they brings a different energy. The time of day, is it before lunch? Is it after lunch? All of these, I just want to soak those things in and realize that, hey, they're neither good nor bad. They just are. And the only thing I can control is myself as I walk into that. So I want to really soak that in and try and just get an understanding of that before I go try and communicate.
You mentioned, obviously, speaking at code schools and things like that, and with that audience. And as we talked about at the very beginning, what you do is you actually create web and mobile experiences. I think what's really interesting about that word experience is it really sort of ties into that whole time with medieval times as well, where you're creating a very special experience for the 300 to 1,200 people in attendance. But what do you mean by web and mobile experiences today?
Well, we're all humans, or at least most of the people listening to this.
There may be a few bots on a farm somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. There's someone's transcribing, taking the first pass may not be a human. Well, we find ourselves spending a lot of time on technology, and technology is a computer. It uses a different language to communicate. It has different tools and appendages than we have. And oftentimes what can happen is that tension occurs at an interface where two different things meet. And so when we think of an experience, it really should encompass more than just one sense, right? It's not merely your eyes or your ears. Sometimes it can be physical touch, depending on the type of device, right? Many smartphones today have what they would call a haptic response. So when you touch it, it kind of gives you physical feedback. So for us, we want to create an immersive experience because we want to live at that intersection of humanity and computers. We want to live there really well. People and brands that do that well tend to have a special place in our minds. And for many of them, depending on the brand, it could be in our hearts, right? We get excited. They elicit a certain response that others don't, simply because they think what they're trying to do is provide a product or a service. Whereas most of what we need from life, we already have. In the developed world, we have shelter, we have access to food and clean water. Really where there's a premium to be had, both from a profit perspective, everything from the business, but also as a person, is in that full experience. And so we want to bring that from a digital perspective. The core value that we have as a company that corresponds to this is what we call being effectively human. We want to embrace this tension that we are using machines to accomplish more from life, but we are still people, and we don't want to let that go. And that's ultimately the intersection that we want to stand at when we talk about these digital experiences. They should be immersive. They should pull our whole selves in. Honestly, just like a great job. A great job, we are able to bring our whole self to work, and not just the side of our head that can do calculations or the side of our head that can answer phones. But ideally, we get the most when we can bring our whole selves. And so we want to help people create experiences where that is true for their business, for their brand, and ultimately their customers.
And it sounds like what you really want is for folks to be able to interact with this brand, with this tool, without thinking about the brand or tool specifically that they're using, and just overall take an impression from that experience about the connection they have with the organization they're interacting with.
Right, because at the end of the day, if I feel like I'm having to use a tool to accomplish this, right, that just gets in the way. Just like when we think of performing, and I think back to medieval times, why did people come to watch medieval times? It's likely not because they want a lesson in medieval history. Mm-hmm. It's probably because it's their kid's first birthday and they want a memorable moment. Or work is stressful and they want to escape from that. And what I love about performance, both from a theatrical perspective, but also just in creating unique moments in life, is it gives people a gift. And that gift is a break, right? A break from stress, from anxiety. And if you do it well and you do it thoughtfully, it can add value. And it's this great exchange that it can give you 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours, and they can walk away feeling like they gained something that they didn't have before. And so experiences have a way of doing that really in many arenas.
So, I mean, how do the stories that you're telling through these digital experiences compare to stories that you tell from the stage?
They're actually very similar. I think the delivery mechanism is different. Today, we don't use, at our business, we don't use horses and capes and swords. But the reality is...
it might help in some meetings.
Yeah, you know what? That's a great point. I should probably, the next meeting, I might wear a cape and just see what happens. But really, there is still a narrative that is unfolding. As humans, we have a way of remembering stories more than we do just paragraphs of text and information. And so when I think of, I would actually start before clients. It starts with, in our minds, team members. When somebody is thinking about joining a company, what are they telling themselves about that company? And then when they join, oftentimes there's a certain level of excitement, but there's also fear. Okay, well, are you reinforcing that fear by not giving them clear direction and expecting them to figure it out themselves? Or are you amplifying the excitement by giving them enough uniqueness with enough predictability and balancing those things? So in a lot of ways, there's a great framework that I like, and it's called the story brand framework. And it talks about really using the story arc from narratives, from books, movies, plays, and mapping that ultimately to somebody's buying journey. It's very similar. I want to be the hero, right? Somebody else should be the guide. Help me overcome my biggest problems. All of these things, there's so much overlap. And as humans, I think we're wired that way. We want that. We want to, just like I'm sure I'm not the hero of your story, right? You don't go to bed at night thinking, well, man, how did Morgan win the day? Of course not. In most cases, we are our own hero. And so as we walk into a business setting or a buying decision or to go watch a play for 3 hours, there's this idea of a willing suspension of disbelief. I am so bought into what's happening here that I am willing to just put aside any disbelief that I have and just go along for the ride. And I think great brands and great businesses have a way of doing that as well, that we're not really making a rational decision. People rarely pick Apple because it's the best computer, or Windows for that matter. I'm not staking a claim to either side there, but it's not as much of a rational decision as it is an alliance that we're forming with one of those brands, right? How do I view myself, and how do these people either reinforce that or challenge that? And then how do I feel about that? All of that in my mind comes back to a story on one end, and then ultimately someone's performing it or someone's being entertained by it.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And I think, one of the things you talked about before is that, in the developed world especially, we have everything that we need. Nothing that we are selling, nothing that people are buying is something that anybody actually needs. It's all something that somebody wants. And I think that's one of those lessons that salespeople have to learn early in their career, is that you have to help your customer want your product. All of the logic and all the stuff that they need, that's something they'll apply after the fact to justify their decision. But if they don't want it, if they don't want to do business with you, they won't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's an author that I really love, and a phrase that Seth Godin, and he attaches to a lot of the stories that he tells, if you will. But it's all about the stories that we tell ourselves, and that's what it comes back to. And so, where does what you have, where does what you are either inspiring me to do, selling me on, how does that fit into the story that I'm already telling myself? And usually, if you reinforce it, it's going to be easier for you than if you try and challenge it. Because as people, we don't like to be destabilized like that. And so a lot of buying behaviors come back to stories that we tell ourselves and where you fit in that narrative.
And as a speaker, you're always going to be putting yourself in a much harder position if you start off by telling the audience that they're wrong, that their story is wrong.
That's exactly right. Because usually their counter isn't, oh, well, let me try and prove my point. What they're going to start to do is really either dismantle or discredit you, right? So in their mind, they're watching for like, oh, well, what do they know? They did this thing, right? Or they have this mannerism, or look how many times they said, they obviously don't know what they're talking about. And it's just, humans are fascinating. I'm continually drawn back to that statement around it's so fascinating how we view the world, and then really what we place value on, and how honestly what you place value on is likely so different than what I place value on. And if we had a conversation, we may feel like a lot overlaps, but the reality is why I value that thing could be drastically different than why you value that. But ultimately that comes back to that story.
Exactly. And that's the other pitfall then speakers have to be aware of and salespeople have to be aware of, is that don't assume your customer values the same thing that you value. You've got to find out what they value first, and then you can more easily connect with them.
That's exactly right. There's two things that I was sharing with some team members recently. They were asking, how do I get this other group to understand what I want and just do what I want, was really their kind of just frustration, the way that they had worded it. And I was like, that seems very true, right, at the core. What I had shared with them, I was like, as you're trying to win people over to your side, first you need to lead either with a story that gets at or introduces them to the frustration that you're having in some sort, right? You need to draw them in to that direction, or start with why. Why does it matter? And then, or both, if you have time and or their attention long enough, both of those things have a way of shifting things in people's minds to where if you can't speak that language, speak their language, then it's really hard to present a compelling case or to change someone's opinion, because they have these beliefs that they're ultimately defending. And if you know what those are, then I think you'd be foolish not to adjust how you're presenting things to them. Sometimes what I'll do in presentations is actually start with Q&A. So not wait till the end, but start with a question around what are their fears, right? So talking to code school students is a great example, because these are students who have likely left a job, they've left a traditional education, and they're in this room learning a lot. They are scared that they're not going to be able to get a job. They feel like imposters because you have some places you get 4-year degrees to get what they're trying to get in 10 weeks. And so I'll just open the floor. It helps break down some of the barriers as well in the room, because it doesn't create this, I'm declaring this thing on high. But then I just want to hear what they're saying. I'm listening for the words that they're using. So in this specific instance, something that comes up a lot is imposter syndrome, right? That is a phrase either that they've heard or they've latched onto. And so as I'm describing my journey, what do I want to do? I want to include stories where I've felt like an imposter too, because it creates this beautiful thing that is so unique to humans, and it's called empathy. And if we can establish empathy with the people that we are talking to, or in business, the people that we are selling to, the depth of the relationship, which is exactly what it is if you are one-on-one talking to somebody or presenting on stage or performing, you are building a relationship with them. And if they can establish a level of empathy with you and start to see themselves in you, that ultimately is the challenge that really starts to move the needle.
Yeah, excellent point. When we talk about imposter syndrome, I think one of the keys to being to success, one of the things that helps with success in corporate life especially, is looking around. And so many people feel like they're a fraud, that they're about to be found out, that they've got no business doing this, that everybody else knows what they're doing. And you know what? Everybody else feels that same way too. Nearly everybody else is convinced that they're a fraud, that they don't know what they're doing, and that they're going to get found out. Relax, that's normal.
Exactly. I have a longtime friend who became my business partner, and we actually coached rec soccer as kids. We were in high school. This was, I don't know who put us in charge, but they let us coach these young kids. And I would talk to parents, and my friend would always look over at me afterwards and like, man, it feels like you're just carrying on conversations with adults like you know what they're talking about. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I kind of rolled it off at the time. And I always felt like, yeah, maybe I'm, pretending or sure, I don't know all the nuance or whatever, but, I can hold my own, whatever. And I think as I grew up, what I realized was they were pretending too. I rarely meet an adult who doesn't feel like they're still figuring it out. What I love and admire about my parents is as I've continued to grow up, they've become more and more vulnerable about that. And I'm realizing, as I realize my parents are human, and the teachers that I went to school with who taught me, they were human. And as we start to rope this in together, and I'm meeting people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who admit unashamedly, I'm thinking about changing my jobs, or I don't know if I should do this. And the uncertainty and the doubt is part of the human condition. And so often we're worried about what will people think, or will I fit in here, or do I have what it takes? And we look at other people who have done it. They've done what it takes. They've showed up. We revere them as a society. And the reality is they were just faking it too. And at a team that I work with, we joke about this often, because in many cases, historically, the people who've actually made a difference, made an impact in the world, they were the crazy people.
Huh.
Until one day they weren't. Right? The thing that they were talking about, or planning on, or building once upon a time was insane. I think of the Wright brothers. They built one of the first flying machines in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, crashing off of beach sand dunes. That had never been done before. Oh, a plane that's lighter than air? That's not real. Until all of a sudden it was. Right? And so the switch from crazy to genius isn't this long road. It's like, no, you are crazy for most of the time. Until you're proven right. And then all of a sudden history throws their weight behind you and says, you were brilliant, you're a pioneer. But the reality is the road to get there was not paved with rose petals and celebrations. It was paved with hard work and being that crazy person. No one's exempt from that. We're all in that boat together. And once we are able to just embrace that tension and that discomfort and say, you know what, I don't need people's public approval, because deep down, if they were honest, they feel just as insecure as I do. I'm just going to go for it and then see what I can do. It's such a sweet place if you can be willing to just embrace that boldness and, as we would say, go boldly forward.
Absolutely. You just have to go ahead and try it and do it and figure it out and live in a way that's going to be true to yourself.
Absolutely.
So with a company focused on web and digital experiences and, being able to coach folks on how to learn code and all this high-tech stuff, that would seem to indicate that you could use all sorts of high-end digital tech and fancy slides in your talks. Do you incorporate a lot of that technology to sort of really wow the audience?
Not usually. I try and keep it pretty simple. I think that oftentimes surprises people, right? They expect a technologist to come up and try and use the hottest tools and all of these things. But going back to that idea of empathy and not trying to come from my perspective, but trying to meet the audience where they are, I want to keep it pretty simple, right? And I want to, if I feel like it could add to the value of what I'm trying to communicate, then sure, I'll pull it in. But in many cases, those things can be distractions, and people who feel like they have to include those things are usually, or can, maybe I want to be careful here not to overgeneralize, but they can be trying to mask for an insecurity of their own, right? Feeling like I need to prove myself to you. And if I've developed anything over time, I would say it is an unwavering confidence in the fact that I'm going to be me. And if that doesn't work for you, then that's absolutely fine. But the more vulnerable I've been and the more true to myself that I've tried to stay, I think when the right people connect with me, it creates a very special opportunity that if I tried to be something else or tried to layer in too much extra, then it would often take away from those very unique, vulnerable moments.
I think you said something very interesting there too about, the right people connecting with you. You don't have to connect with absolutely everybody. You just need to make sure that you can connect with the right people.
That's right. I actually learned that when I was serving at Medieval Times. I want everyone to have a great time. And usually our sections would include 30 to 40 people. But the important person to connect with me is the one who has the wallet, right?
Right.
Because at the end of the night, I work on tips. And if that person connected with me or felt like I connected with their kids, we're going to be at a much better place. And so while everyone matters, there are certain people that if you win them, you kind of win it all. And much in the same way, in a group, we can get caught up in wanting to please everyone. But the reality is it's not for everyone. And if you can come around and get an understanding of who it is for, and then get really good at talking to those people, you can speak to them with a depth of knowledge and understanding that really shakes them in a way that they often don't get elsewhere. So I share this a lot with clients, but if you wanted to sell me on a book about parenting, I'm probably not going to buy it, largely because there are 1,000 other titles on the shelf. But if you wanted to sell me a book for fathers who are entrepreneurs and have daughters, I would buy it probably before you wrote it. Why? Because I'm your customer. I know that. Right? There's so much clarity. There's so many answers that I feel like that book would have because it is my book. It feels like almost like it was written for me. And we shoot really broad sometimes thinking that that's the answer, but so much of really, I think where the future is heading, the web has done a great job of connecting everyone, which is kind of connecting at this point. Very few people are really connecting in depth. But where we're heading is highly curated, very niche. And if we can start to speak the language of a very small few and win their loyalty, we may get the opportunity to speak to more and win the masses. But nowadays, it feels very rare that it happens the other way around.
And what's really interesting and I suppose kind of ironic too, is that as you talk about connecting everybody, but really getting niching down and connecting with few very specific folks, what we find in the podcasting space is that the more niche and the more specific your show, the larger your audience ends up being.
That's exactly right. I could see, and I think of the podcasts that I listen to, they tend to be very specific. And they're also really easy to share because, if I brush shoulders with 50 people in a day, well, if I have a very specific resource for somebody, as soon as I meet somebody who kind of checks all those boxes, right, then I have exactly the right thing for them. And usually that's a very small toolbox. So I'll use the example of fathers who are entrepreneurs raising daughters. That's so niche. And so when I see somebody who checks those boxes, I'm thinking, oh, I know how unique this is. Therefore, you're my people and I've got things I want to show you. And it's so, just like if I asked, what was your favorite memory of 2018? It might, you may have one or two, or you're trying to figure out, well, shoot, these are really close. How do I separate them? But if I said, what was your favorite memory with a loved one over a meal? All of a sudden, I've sliced through the noise into something that your mind is naturally predisposed to start filtering everything else out. And so the clarity that creates is really impactful. And so the same thing happens in business and in other areas of life as well. So I have no doubt that same truth resonates in podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so you've been doing a lot of these web and digital experiences with Polar Notion, but you also work with another company called New Story. What is New Story?
So New Story is an organization about 4 years old, and we are pioneering solutions to end global homelessness. And it sounds a little like a platitude and just stuff millennials say, but the reality is we're investing a lot of time and energy into building technology, both software solutions and hardware solutions that really start to move the needle on this 1 billion person problem that is global homelessness. One of our biggest things that many people may have seen online in the last 12 months is the launch of a 3D printer that we did in Austin, Texas earlier last year. It's a pretty big deal, the first of its kind, and we're now that we've really started to dial in that technology, moving it in country in the future to start to print homes in around 12 to 15 hours to really, again, the goal is to turn up the speed with which we can deliver these homes. What we know from research, from governments and nonprofits, enough money exists to actually end this problem, but the issue is the logistics behind it. And so we are trying to move the needle there. We also have software tools that survey families who get these homes, that track progress on home construction. And so we're trying to supplement the sector that has been under-resourced for so long and give them the tools to really, within the next 2 to 3 decades, see what we can do to make sure that no person grows up living in what we would consider survival mode.
That's awesome. And that also has powerful implications for things like disaster preparedness and relief.
Absolutely. One of the things, and this is not necessarily a team mantra per se, but a world in which I could imagine if we think of natural disasters that come through. And today, the way that it usually works is a hurricane will hit Haiti, and then aid organizations will come in and provide food, and they'll bring tents and, kind of assemble these triage areas. But what if you erect physical structure made of concrete in the same time it took to erect a tent with a tin roof, right? Today in Haiti, after the earthquakes years and years ago, people are still living in tents that were only meant to last 6 months. Such a huge problem. But what if you could go in after a natural disaster, clear the debris, and just start laying homes that would last 5, 6, 7, 8 decades, right? We don't obviously we don't have all the information on it in terms of the duration there, but generations.
Sure.
That quickly, right? Because that's a problem today. We can't do that, and so that is something where I think we're moving towards that future, and just as quickly as Mother Nature's knocking them down, if we can be putting them back up, but something more long term, I think we're onto something that's pretty compelling and really starts to have impact across the world.
And really sort of start giving people a base where they can build the rest of their lives.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot more back to some of the college philosophy we were taking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We touched on this a little bit earlier about in the developed world, we have access to food, shelter, and clean water. But in order to be able to do other things with our lives, we first need to secure that food, shelter, and clean water. Once we have that foundation, then we can move up to the next level of things we want to accomplish. Once we have that solid, then we have a base that we can build on these other things. But you can't, it's a heck of a lot harder to build an extraordinary life and to live the life you really want and you really feel called to live if you don't have that solid basis from which you can launch that next step.
Absolutely. And I think we try, right? If those things aren't in place, we still try to do that. We try to build love and belonging and esteem on top of that, but it's always a very shaky foundation when those basic physiological needs can be taken from us at any moment. And so one of the beautiful things that we've seen in communities that we've built homes is almost immediately people start doing things like starting businesses out of these homes. Right? So they're figuring out not only how can I just sleep more at nighttime, how can I leverage this to then do more with it? They are inviting family members from a long way off who also have more insecurity around their homes to come live with them. They are doing all of these things that you would imagine, that we've almost taken for granted for many years in the developed world. But we can just see it start to happen so quickly. Almost immediately, people are putting fences around their property because safety is on that list, but it's comes later, and health starts to improve and all these things. But the home is such an important foundation that it can really start to shift pretty quickly. And we're also looking to partner with other organizations that provide these other needs, right? Water, education, health. We call them co-creators, people creating these communities with us. So not merely homes, but communities. So all of that comes together, but absolutely that shelter is so foundational.
I talk more about this on my other show about stroke recovery, but we're learning more and more about the importance of sleep and just the basics of getting decent sleep for health, for recovering from anything, for being able to, give your brain the ability to go ahead and do the next things. And if all you can do is live in a tent or live on the street or not have home, not have shelter, you cannot get a good night's sleep. And if you can't get a good night's sleep, everything else is impacted.
Absolutely. That's so true. And we're even seeing a lot in the tech space, and more information is coming out because it's so, for so many years, it's been this hustle, grind, go mentality. And these tech leaders are coming out saying, hey, yeah, 8 hours of sleep. Let's not forget that as humans, we need that. We're cognitive beings. And so much depends on those things. And it's just so true that we want to forget it because I could go a day without sleep. I could probably go 2 days without sleep. And so it feels less important. But the reality is, it's really important to establish a really solid baseline there. And so much of that comes back to, do I feel safe when I put my head down? Is it dry? Is water dripping on my head when I'm sleeping? Is it a calm place? So yeah, so much comes back to the value of a structure and a safe place to live.
Speaking about about, especially in the tech world, all this stuff we want to get done that we try and sacrifice sleep, or we still have to get that 8 hours. But I mean, how do you manage the busy roles of a CEO role at one company and CTO role at another startup? How do you balance that?
Two things come to mind. Well, I would say three. Discipline is pretty huge. So I have a pretty rigorous schedule. I go to bed pretty early. I'm usually in bed about 9:30. I have a lot of a window of time in the morning that's pretty distraction free to be able to do that. So that is absolutely helpful. Communication is huge. So communicating expectations and communicating, where I am, where I'm heading, really to both teams is an important part. And then the last piece, I will say, quite frankly, with those that I work with, is their generosity and their graciousness with me. There are plenty of times where I'll come in 5 minutes late for a meeting, 10 minutes late for a meeting. I'll miss a call for something. And while I try my best to make sure that it's not, that I get it right more than I get it wrong, there are so many times where the awesome teams that I have around me are just willing to tolerate what I would consider maybe some peculiarities that they don't necessarily have to put up with other people. But I'm met with a lot of graciousness there, and still plenty of people who are willing to shoot it straight and give me hard feedback. But that's something that I never want to discount, because at the end of the day, even I think of my wife, who puts up with a lot. And it usually takes me a while to wind down in the evenings because I'm going 100 miles an hour. And all of the generous and gracious people in my life who support these pursuits.
That idea of getting that hard feedback and having folks who are willing and able to give a C-level executive the hard feedback, that's got to be just an invaluable resource.
It is, and I will say that's something that as holding back, because maybe they wonder, like, what's he going to say, or is it my place to do this? And really,
you control their addiction to food, shelter, and clothing in many cases.
Yeah, there's a lot of power that comes with that. And so for me, it's really almost over inviting opportunities, right? Giving them autonomy, trusting them to do it. And then when I mess up, I'm going to own it twice as often, right? Twice as much, and model those behaviors, simply because people need to realize that I'm just a human. I need just as much sleep. I am just as dependent upon encouragement and inspiration as anybody else. And so being consistent about giving people that invitation over and over again is something that I feel like has continued to help. But it's definitely something, the momentum is certainly not carrying me in that direction, because so much of even the way that we traditionally see business leaders and owners and executives or whatever, they want to like put up this wall and feel like they are almost like more than human. And for me, it's really important to just hold on to that humanity, because especially in the technology and software space, it's kind of easy to shed it because most of what I do is hide behind a screen, right? I send emails, we write software, and everything can feel so sterile and whitewashed. But the reality is, what makes us beautiful creatures is our ability to collaborate and to create. And I don't want to ever create an environment in which those things aren't true. And so it's a very active pursuit, even as we grow and evolve and change.
How do these two different companies tie together for your own personal, broader mission? Or how do they feed what you do, what you want to get out of life?
Yeah, I tend to think in terms of Venn diagrams. And I would say if there is a three-way Venn diagram here, it is business, technology, and social impact. So for a news story, a lot of the work that we're doing is helping people on the ground. But my hope is not only to help the people we're serving, but the team that I'm a part of. I want to make their lives, their jobs better. And with Polar Notion, yes, we're creating brand experiences for other people, but it should be a great place to come to work. And we do a lot of mentorship and apprenticing of underskilled people to level them up and give them those opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so in both spheres, they are in the technology space, very heavily rooted businesses for sure. But really trying to figure out how do we make this count for more than just ROI or a line on a P&L, but really impact every single person in that process. And we wrap that together as human-centered business would be the title there. But for me personally, that culminates into this idea of pioneering a more beautiful future for others. Pioneering in the sense that it should be things that haven't been done before or should have a unique perspective. I like the idea of beautiful because it implies a level of subjectivity, future, forward thinking. But then the deeper why is for others, not for myself to make myself better, bigger, higher esteem, but really to give other people that opportunity. And I think doing that over and over again in different contexts will likely have an impact and have a legacy that one day my girls, future children, can see that it's something that they ultimately are proud to say that was my dad.
So, I mean, what's been the most personally rewarding presentation that you've done?
I think from a learning perspective, I'm a pretty voracious learner. That first ride out on the horse, I think still has the depth of reward there. I think transcends so many things that I come back to that often mentally, but then even in, kind of a call to something that has been personally rewarding, I feel like that was more than a realization at that moment. It was a gift that has influenced a lot of things. The second one would be, if I had to, not reuse the original one there, when I got to sit across the table from the founders of News Story and share my own personal journey and experience. And it was a very low key, right? There were no microphones, and you can't find this recording online, but presented to them why this mission and this vision was something that fit me. I think that was something that I could have just as easily dismissed that opportunity, right? I had a job, a business that I've been building for years, and I had plenty of things to do. I wasn't bored, but choosing to just step up and embrace some additional struggle and some additional efforts. It was something that I look back and am pleased beyond measure that I was invited to have that presentation, but then also that I just took it. And before I spoke to them, I shared the opportunity with my wife, who'd been working through this whole entrepreneurship journey with me for many years. And I showed her this. And I was like, I know this sounds crazy, but what do you think? And she said, you have to do this. This sounds just right for you. And that was something that, looking back, I can't imagine how different my life would look if I didn't show up for that presentation.
What's really compelling about that is that those rewarding presentations happen at the turning points of your life, at the key points where your life can go down one path or down another. And it's making that presentation, it's having that talk that made all the difference in where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Morgan, if folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
They can check me out on my website, Morgan J. Lopes, MorganJLopes.com, or check us out at polarnotion.com.
Morgan, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today, especially since we've been talking about how time can be so precious in trying to get everything done. I've learned a bunch of stuff, and you've shared some great stories with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate the time. Great questions. Definitely enjoyed it.
Again and again, we hear about the importance of storytelling in sharing your message. Whether it's an online experience, a tale of times gone by, or a speech about changing the world, if you're not telling stories in your talk, you are leaving a powerful tool at home. One of the things we talked about is the importance of the niche. It's a bit counterintuitive, right? I mean, the more narrow you get, the bigger your audience can actually grow. But at another level, that doesn't make sense. Don't you want to just appeal to everybody as much as possible? That doesn't quite work. There's more to it than that. You see, specificity matters. When we're looking for stuff online, we're not looking for the millions of results. We are looking for the one result that will solve our problem, that will address the solution we are looking for. And that specificity, that niche, is where a lot of other folks are going to go too. You see, Morgan could have introduced himself as a former dinner theater performer, and that's fine. I mean, it would have been interesting to ask about that, but to actually go and describe himself to me and his initial proposal as the narrator in the medieval times restaurant chain, well, now that's a heck of a lot more interesting. I want to know more about that. Even if you don't know what medieval times is, it certainly inspires more questions. So when you're telling your stories and making your points and delivering examples in a talk, whether it's going to be in a conference room, whether it's going to be in a hotel ballroom, whether it's going to be in a webinar, whether it's going to be sort of sitting around with some friends at a coffee shop, think about how you can make that story more specific. Instead of talking about drinking a cup of coffee, what kind of coffee was it? How can you put your audience there with you when you're telling the story? How can you help them visualize what you're doing? Because if they can visualize that story better, then they can visualize that solution better. The more you can engage with them, the more you can connect with them at an emotional level, at a deeper level than just the logical level, the more specific you can be. Because if your story is specific, a member of the audience can picture themselves there. When Morgan tells his story, he doesn't just talk about being nervous. He talks about straddling the horse, losing that sense of time, and more as he's waiting for those trumpets to blare and that curtain to open. And that's why we want to listen. That's why we want to hear that story. And that's why we can connect with it. If he says nervous, it's like, well, yeah, I remember when I was nervous. But if he talks about how he actually felt, what being nervous meant, what the world looked like to him, we can relate that better to how the world looked to us when we were nervous, about how our bodies responded. That specificity is key. So now about that update I mentioned earlier. I've recently taken a job as a contractor with Microsoft. I'm working in the Microsoft News Labs organization, helping journalists use Microsoft Office applications like PowerPoint to do their jobs. Of course, it's not affiliated with this show, and this show does not reflect the views of Microsoft, etc., etc. Submit all standard disclaimers here. But since it is adjacent, and I am professionally talking about PowerPoint, and I talk about PowerPoint a lot on this show, I did want to mention that. So to learn more about the work that Morgan is doing, be sure to check out the show notes over at 2minutetalktips.com/Morgan. Can you think of two people who might be interested in this conversation, either learning more about medieval times or about managing that busy executive life or about storytelling and mobile and web experiences or anything like that? Can you imagine two people who might be interested? Go ahead and send them the link, 2minutetalktips.com/Morgan, and encourage them to check it out. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.